Ayles' wager for a lady's heart. Written by Abby Ayles and published by Starfall Publications. Save more with our offers and bundles on our website starfallpublicationsbooks.com. Subscribe for more audiobooks. Enjoy. Chapter 1. Winston Ambrose ran his fingers along the cards in his hand, relishing the moment of anticipation that always came to him the half-second before he flipped them up and saw what he had to work with. Whist, he'd learned over the years, was like life. You could strategize and bluff your way through the most complicated bits, but there would always be an element you couldn't control. He hated that element and longed for it at the same time. Lord Longberry. Winston looked up at the sound of his name. They'd turned over trumps. Hearts, of course. He winced at the irony and took a swig of sherry out of the glass near at hand. His partner, a man he'd played with occasionally but didn't know well, had dealt the hand and drawn the trump into play. Heath Lowell, Lord Rywell in polite company, had played as well, catering to the dealer, and it was Winston's turn. "Hearts again," he grunted, throwing out a low card. "You're a sour one tonight," Heath said in a mocking tone. "Come now, what's gotten under your bonnet?" Heath had come into Winston's life only a few years ago, but he'd stayed by the young Earl's side with creeping stubbornness, and before he knew it, Winston found his name rarely bandied about without Heath's alongside. Heath was a foil to him in almost every way. He was short, where Winston was tall, fair where Winston was dark, blue eyes to Winston's green, calculating to Winston's own rakish charm. Sometimes Winston wondered whether he knew the truth of what went on behind his companion's small, bright eyes, but such a measure of understanding would require true friendship, and Lord Longberry was not known for his lasting connections. They went 2 more rounds, and the tricks were not in favour of Winston and his partner. "It's a good thing we bet split," the other man grumbled halfway through the game. "If not, I'd be going out as skinned as a pig tonight." Winston took another drink. "I'm unlucky," he said at last. "It's the hearts." "Is this about Lady Charlotte again?" Heath rolled his eyes as though the very mention of her name was a weariness to him. "Truly, you shouldn't pride yourself so much. You are not the first man Lady Charlotte has rejected, and you won't be the last." Winston shot him a sharp glance across the table as they finished the round. It was not Heath's right to present his romantic troubles so openly before a table of strangers. When asked to do another game, Winston's partner stood up sharply and, with a black glare at Winston, gathered his meagre winnings. "I'll not keep up with luck such as his," he said. "I'll only lose more, and my name won't handle it." Heath's partner pled his case as well, and when they had gone, he turned to Winston with a raised eyebrow. They were alone in the men's club now, but for a small group of men tossing hazard by the fireside. "What about you, old boy? Are you keen on turning in early, or could I tempt you to a game of piquet? We're private now, and you can tell me all that happened with the lovely Charlotte Alencourt this evening." Winston felt a misgiving at the suggestion, but he had long ago learned to bury such pangs of conscience under layers of bravado and extravagance. He pulled out his purse and emptied the contents onto the table between them. Deal. "You give us rich gentlemen a bad name, Winston, squandering away your evening as such. Then I'm in good company." He poured himself another glass of sherry, while his friend dealt out the hands. When he'd drawn up his cards, he ventured a comment at last about the evening's events. "You saw it, after all. The 3rd ball of the London season, and she wouldn't speak 2 words to me after the dance. Did you say anything to offend?" Heath picked up his cards and rearranged them, pushing a pile of money forward into the centre of the table. "How am I to know what goes on in a woman's mind?" He knocked on the table to declare his first category, and watched as Heath did the same. His hand was not good, but he hoped he could bluff through it. We spoke of the weather. I flirted a bit, I'll not deny it, but she did as well. Women are fickle creatures. She may feel drawn to you tomorrow, though she spurned you tonight. Winston thought about their conversation on the dance floor. They'd whirled in graceful bliss for a whole reel, but when they exited the dance floor, she'd spurned his attempts at wooing her. "Please," he'd said with a bow, "tell me I can see you again tomorrow." She had smiled that coy, untouchable smile, and then curtsied deeply. "I am sorry, I cannot wish it, and it would be best if you thought no further on the subject." He'd been too shocked to answer at first, and she rushed on with a blush. "You have a reputation," she said softly. "My father would not like it, and I cannot hand my heart to you to have it crumpled up and tossed into the nearest gutter. Go find easier prey, perhaps one of those ladies on the other side of the dance floor who haven't taken their eyes off you all night." Her refusal had made her even more attractive. "She is the loveliest woman I have ever seen." Winston was beginning to regret the sherry as he went through the motions of gameplay, tossing out suits and taking tricks. His mind was not as sharp as it should have been, and by the end of the round, Heath had won handily. Yes, nothing like that horrendous Miss Leighton. Winston looked up in surprise as he gathered the cards to shuffle and deal afresh. "Grace Leighton? Why are you speaking of her?" He gave a scornful laugh and flipped the cards expertly through his hands. Surely using her name alongside that of Charlotte Alencourt is a sacrilege of some sort. Heath's eyes narrowed. "Some have found her charms irresistible." "Who?" "I've not seen her once this season, and I know the town would hear about it in a moment if a baron's daughter, as well accomplished as her were, to earn the attentions of an admirer. No, she's not crushed by suitors for one simple fact." Winston pushed the last of his money into the centre of the circle. A smile played at the edges of Heath's mouth. "She's hard on the eyes, you mean?" "She's no Lady Charlotte, that's for certain." Winston allowed his thoughts to play gently with the memory of Charlotte's blonde curls, ample bosom, and pale blue eyes gazing up at him from her petite place at his side that evening. She was a vision, an angel who deserved proper worship. Miss Leighton, on the other hand, was a tall and scrawny redhead whose considerable fortune couldn't quite disguise her abrupt plainness and her propensity for boring obsession with charitable missions about the city. She was bookish and sharp-edged. Winston thought with a smile that she'd only now entered his mind because of Heath's recommendation. Before that, she hadn't even crossed his vision. Who could think of Miss Leighton when Lady Charlotte was near? 2 rounds later, and Winston was glowering over the table at all his money and his father's treasured watch piled high on Heath's side. "Lord Rywell," he said coldly, "is this your plan? To cheer me up by stealing all my money and my family heirlooms?" Heath shrugged half-heartedly. "If you win this round, you will have it all back. And if not, I have nothing left with which to wager." Winston stood and stretched. "I have no choice but to go home. Come, my man, don't be a poor sport. Here, I've just had a grand idea." Heath brightened innocently, which Winston had come to learn was a dangerous thing. "Why don't we make this all a bit more interesting?" Winston sat back down. That sentence was the surest way to bring him back to the negotiating table. "Go on." "I'll let it all go. The debt you've compiled tonight, including your father's watch. If you seduce a woman of my choosing, make her fall in love with you, and when you've done so, and you can prove it, I will release you from the debts. It will be a gentleman's agreement." Winston laughed, then looked at his friend again. "Are you in earnest?" I am. I may have struck ill with Charlotte Alencourt, but you speak as though I have lost my touch with the feminine mind altogether. You know as well as I that I could walk into any tea-house in the area and have 3 ladies fawning on my arm in minutes. He smiled, the confident sign he often used to hide his discomfort. It won't be fair to you, to lose all your money so quickly. You forget that I get to choose the lady. Winston rolled his eyes. Even if you choose Lady Charlotte herself, I am not dismayed. I can win her, I intend to anyway, within a matter of months. Her initial walls will be broken down by my enchanting ways. He was making light of the matter, but both he and Heath knew it was true. Lady Charlotte didn't really stand a chance once Winston set his eyes on her, an earl, and a handsome one at that. He had all the aces in his hand, and would triumph in the end. So, do you accept? Winston shrugged. All right. You have won me over to your foolish plot, and I accept. Who will be the lady? Heath smiled slowly, like a weasel sighting its prey. Miss Grace Leighton. Winston felt a great drop of spirit. It was not like being assigned an insurmountable task, for surely a lady as plain and unpursued as Miss Leighton would be an easy enough mark. It was an insult, rather, to Winston's prowess that Heath would pick someone so unappealing. Why? He asked at last. It doesn't matter. It's all in the bet. Make her love you and prove it to me within, say, 4 months. If you don't, I will have the sum owed me and your father's watch back in my possession. She's a recluse. Winston rolled his eyes. And a dull one, I imagine. Couldn't you have at least given me a challenge that will be enjoyable to undertake? You have substituted the fox in my fox hunt with an old, tired hound. She's not old. Winston looked at the watch still in his friend's fingers. He saw it as he had seen it years before in his father's hand, as his mother and sister were loaded into the carriage for the sea voyage that had claimed their lives in the end. He was supposed to go with them, it was all arranged, but in the end he was too unwell to go, just a boy of 15 and an angry boy at that, left out of all the fun to stay home abed in the great estate alone. He remembered his sister's pleas that he should be allowed to travel. He is fit enough, she'd said, casting him a pitying smile. If you leave him here, he will go mad with boredom and loneliness. She'd had dark hair, like his, in soft ringlets. They had been very close, her 2 years younger and always tagging along after his adventures. I can't risk the heir to the Longberry title if your illness were to develop into anything more serious at sea, his father had said, pulling out that watch on its golden chain and pressing it into his hand. It had the estate emblem on the back. Keep watch for us, son. Time will pass quickly. It hadn't. In some ways, Winston felt time was still frozen in that moment on the front terrace, with his father's kind eyes and his mother's sweet smile, his sister tossing a smile over her shoulder as she climbed into the carriage, the breeze frozen on her curls, the watch in his hand. He looked up at Heath with a pained expression. Give me the watch now, and I will have Miss Leighton confessing her love within the span of 4 months. If anything goes awry, I will return it to you. He forced a smile. But nothing will go awry. Chapter 2. She pulled her long hair forward so that it fell over her shoulders in a brilliant red fountain, or that's how it would have fallen if it behaved as other women's hair did. Grace smiled wryly at her image in the floor-length mirror alongside her vanity table. Her hair, almost orange in its intensity, frizzed out like it was weary of gravity itself. Her face was pale, thin, and plain, like everything about her. She had freckles that her mother detested sprinkled along her cheeks, and her blue eyes stared out as though they were scared of the rest of her. She pulled her face into a smile, then dropped it again into a set look of confidence. The former was what her mother always wanted, but the latter got more things done in London. She pulled her hair back tight against her head, hurrying to finish it all before the maid arrived. She couldn't bear all the fussing and attempts at beautifying that would doubtless come again from her well-meaning lady-in-waiting. The more you painted an ugly thing, she thought wryly, the more people wondered what you were hiding. Miss! It was her maid, earlier than usual, but still too late to attire her mistress. Are you finished, my lady? I am. Grace tried to smile winningly, but caught sight of herself in the mirror and ended up laughing at the sad attempt. Do you want me to braid your hair? Are you certain of that dress? You know your mother prefers lighter colours. Grace struggled to hide her annoyance. I'm going into town later to see the children at the orphanage. I cannot wear pale colours when I am kneeling in the dirt, now, can I? And no, don't bother with my hair. We both know it will tend towards exhaustion only moments after you finish. The maid let out a whisper of a sigh. Your mother would like to see you, miss. Already? Grace usually beat her mother to the breakfast room in the morning. Yes, she's in the sitting room. Grace wondered if other women felt that sinking misgiving in their chest when they were invited to speak with their mothers. She didn't like to be so unkind, but she knew with certainty what her mother would want to say. Last night, Grace had avoided yet another London season ball, and the Baroness would surely be worried that yet another chance to marry off her daughter to a respectable mate had been sidestepped. Grace followed the maid downstairs with a heavy heart and even heavier steps. Her mother was inside, bent gracefully over a bit of embroidery. Baroness Leighton was a world of difference from her gangly daughter, all the height and hair and awkwardness Grace had inherited from her father, and she had none of the sweet petite features or dark brown eyes and hair of her mother, who had been the talk of the town in her youth. The Baroness looked up when she entered, smiling a little too broadly. Grace, how lovely you look today. Grace let the lie slide as she always did. Did you already breakfast, mother? I did not. I wish to speak with you first, on an important matter. The Baroness waved a white, paper-thin hand to the nearby settee. Please, dear. You're making me nervous. Grace sat in silence and folded her hands. Her mother peered at her chest. Dear, do you know they have stays with a little cushion that might give you... She cleared her throat. A little lift, as it were. Grace looked down at her boyish chest and then back at her mother with a carefully constrained face. She would not be drawn into another loud argument. She would not. Never mind. The Baroness continued breezily. I wish to speak with you about last night. I hear you did not go to the ball we were invited to on North Side. You promised you would consider it. I did consider it, Mama. She had considered it, for a few moments at least, but then she'd remembered, as she always did, that such events were grand and useless shows for the sake of attracting men who would tie down your independence for life. Any man that showed an interest in Grace was really showing an interest in her money. She'd learned that lesson a long time ago. With a pang, she thought of Charles and his stuttering apologies the last time she'd seen him all those years ago. He'd looked so saddened and embarrassed. She'd felt almost sorry for him, but not quite, standing there with her own shattered heart bleeding out before his eyes. Well, you should have gone. The Baroness was not ready to give up, not yet. I will speak frankly with you, Grace. I don't want you to end up like Marion. Marion was Grace's aunt, a spinster who had lived alone until she died at the age of 42. Grace had loved Marion, had profited from her education and passion for the poor, but it was always a relationship that her mother had frowned upon. She feared that Marian's happiness in singleness would encourage Grace to pursue things other than matrimony, and Grace thought her fears were likely true. Grace had watched her aunt with pride and envy. Even now, she thought of her fondly. "Do you want your life to go to waste?" her mother was asking. "It is not wasted," Grace protested softly. "I don't want to devote myself to a man I do not love. I have pursuits of my own I enjoy, and I want to help others." "This is all nonsense," her mother snapped. "You must attend the London season this year. You are 23 years old, far past the youthful age that attracts young men, and if you continue much longer, you will be lost to us entirely. At this point, I would be content if you would bring even a member of the titled gentry into this home, so long as he was respectable and well-apportioned." Her voice softened somewhat. "How can you write off all the men in London, Grace? If it's your heart you desire to follow, then choose one you could love. Who would love you in return?" Grace looked at her mother in silence for a moment. When she spoke at last, she hated how her voice cracked. "Mama, how foolish would a man have to be to fall in love with this?" She waved her hand over her body dismissively. "Oh, daughter, you're not that bad." Grace shut her mouth, desperate to escape this conversation. She wanted to be away from her mother's lily-white hands and perfectly shaped face, so full of desire and disappointment. If only she had been someone her mother could be proud of. But life was not made for if-onlys, and Grace had learned after that awful summer afternoon with Charles that if she stopped long enough to wallow in self-pity and her own broken heart, then she might never rise again. "You must make yourself useful to the world," Aunt Marian had always said. "One was not useful if one was wallowing. Go for my sake," her mother said at last. "Just a few dances. Go out today and order a new dress for the season and attend a few balls. If nothing comes of it, I cannot complain." Grace doubted that, but she was weary of all the discussion. "I will go," she relented, "but I have other business in town today, at the orphanage, and I cannot spend all my hours choosing fabrics and styles. I will stop in and find something simple, but then I will be on my way." "As long as you promise to attend the season." Grace rose and curtsied. "I promise." In truth, she suspected she could get by with 1 or 2 dances this season, enough to appease her mother, and then she would be permitted to give her time as she wished in the back streets of London. Aunt Marian had taught her about the people who lived outside of the proper high society circles, of the children crawling in frozen gutters and the women forced to sell their virtue in the dark alleys. It moved Grace, more than any sense of propriety or knowledge of social standing ever had. She looked with wonderment at the glowing women who passed in and out of her home with their heads full of social calls and the newest cloth from France. How beautiful it would be, she often thought, to be content with only those things to occupy one's mind, if only she could lay aside the worries she had about the children in the orphanage, the fears she had about the families she supported in the winter, or the questions she had about the philosophy and intellectual assumptions of the upper class. But no, these ran rampant and left no room for silk or crepe or tulle. She put on a long coat and laced up her sturdy leather boots, headed first to the shop, with her gaze ultimately on the orphanage. In the street outside the dress shop, she passed a bookstore with a small blue volume in the window. The title was written in simple gold script on the cover, "Out of Sight." She stepped inside the shop and picked it up. "Who wrote this?" she asked the shopkeeper. He looked up from the books he was cataloguing and nodded. "Caught your eye?" "It's by John Spencer. You've likely not heard of him. He's new on the scene, but for a few articles of opinion in the papers. A good chap, with a casual way of writing. You feel like he's talking straight to you. Grace smiled to herself and flipped open the first page. She didn't even need to read it. The words came back to her as they had when she first penned them. In the lowest places of London, the wealthy can find all their fears huddling together for warmth. She looked up at the shopkeeper. Is this a pious book? You'd think it, wouldn't you? It's story, fiction, about a boy who raises himself from the street and pursues better things. A bit scandalous and uncomfortable at places, but good. Very good. And thought-provoking. You can tell this Spencer fellow is a scholar. A scholar. Grace blushed at the unintended praise. She'd been writing for 2 years now, and this was her second published book. The first had been a collection of essays and articles, and had not sold well. This second one seemed to have a much more positive reception. She allowed herself a shred of hope that storytelling would move hearts where frank speech and opinion had failed. What makes you think he is a scholar? Allusions. He quotes many an author and many a philosopher. Grace flipped aimlessly through the pages. I dabble in philosophy myself, she said softly. Have you read Kant's Logic? I'm not sure. The shopkeeper's smile faded at once. You do mean Immanuel Kant, do you not? I do. I am simply surprised that such a lady as yourself would even know his name. Surely you have not read any of his works. Grace sighed despite herself at the blatant and unoriginal assumption the bookkeeper was making. Kant believes logic is the science of our understanding, because forming a science is itself an act, and because philosophy is intended to be a science, Kant thinks that logic provides philosophy with the core blueprint of its structure. She watched as the bookkeeper set aside his book very slowly. Without pausing for breath, she pressed on. And therefore, just as it would be important for a lady such as myself to read such things as they would improve my mind in the arena of the home and social structure, I can only imagine philosophy and logic would also be an important blueprint for basic reasoning and thought. The man swallowed. Grace realised she'd taken a step forward and was somehow intimidating him. She shrank back and laid her copy of her own book aside. I haven't the coin to purchase this now, but I will stop by later. You do that, miss. Then, just as she was about to leave, he added, and I will find logic and have it ready for you, miss. Grace broke into a rare smile and stepped outside, the door to the bookstore swinging shut behind her. She crossed the street with a spring in her step. Not even the dress and milliner shop, looming large with its promise of difficult fashion decisions that she felt ill-equipped to answer, could steal the joy that tiny little volume and the grain of confidence from the bookkeeper had given her. Chapter 3. At first, Winston wasn't sure where to begin. Grace Leighton was infamous for her sly avoidance of parties and social gatherings, and despite her family's wealth and consequence, he knew it was possible to go an entire season without laying eyes on her, much less wooing her. He thought perhaps he would drop by her family's manor unexpectedly, but then he wasn't sure what excuse he would give. He had never paid her any mind before. Just as he was thinking the problem over yet again, Destiny stepped in and threw him a lifeline. He looked up from where the livery boy was tethering his horse and saw Miss Grace Leighton slip out of a bookshop and make her way quickly across the street to the milliner's. He couldn't see her face very clearly, but he would have recognised that lanky body and that brilliant carrot-red hair anywhere. Here goes nothing, he said under his breath, making for the shop himself. It was a larger establishment than most in London, with an upstairs devoted to ladies' gowns and fitting, and a downstairs reserved for ribbons and hats. Winston looked around the crowded downstairs room and saw in a moment that Miss Leighton was not there. Could it be that she, a fairly nauseating model of propriety and boredom, was squandering her money on new finery? He smiled to himself at the thought. "Can I help you, sir?" It was a shop girl, and she accompanied the offer with a curtsy. Winston nodded, appreciating her fresh and pretty face. "I'm on the lookout for a new pair of gloves and thought you might have some." "This is a ladies' store, sir," the girl said with some confusion. "Of course!" Winston stumbled over his mistake for a moment, but then, falling back on his usual charm, he smiled broadly at the girl. "I meant a new pair of gloves for my cousin." "Oh, kid or wool?" "Something light, I think." Winston realised with a bit of desperation that he didn't know anything about ladies' gloves, and besides that, if Miss Leighton was there for a dress fitting, it was unlikely she should be downstairs again any time soon. It was up to him to manufacture a reason to stay. "Perhaps if I could see your fabrics." "Of course, sir. I'll fetch the bolts." The girl returned and laid out 6 different colours and textures, each more baffling than the next. Winston ran his fingers over them, as though he was appreciating what they had to offer, all the while painfully aware that the charade could not continue much longer. Then, to his surprise, Miss Leighton appeared in a rustle of muslin and a sigh, followed down the curving staircase by a very out-of-sorts lady-in-waiting. "But, my lady," the woman was protesting, "you can't go yet. We haven't made all the decisions, nor ascertained the fit." Miss Leighton turned around on the stairs, her back to him, and looked back up at the lady. "You measured me, didn't you? And you've made all my dresses in the past. I assure you nothing has changed in my person." "But what of the fabrics?" "You've not chosen a single one, and you were saying this gown is for the season. It will make an impression, and it is your prerogative to choose what that impression might be." "If it really were my prerogative, I would choose to make no impression whatsoever. As it stands, I am here under duress, and therefore will only submit to the absolute minimum of shopping requirements." Winston couldn't see her face, but after a pause, he heard her voice soften, and she put out a pale, freckled hand to the arm of the girl. "Don't worry, Dottie, I trust you. Pick something pretty," she sighed. "I liked the cream, really, I did." "Will you look at ribbons with me, then?" Miss Leighton turned then, to cast her eyes on the clock. "I suppose so, but only for a bit." This was his chance. Winston was too familiar with the art of seduction to leap upon the graces of the lady he sought all at once. No, one must spin a web, make himself seem unreachable but enticing, plant doubt and curiosity. His goal was not to leave the shop with Grace Leighton's hand. He only expected to confirm what he already knew, that she would be open to his suit were he to put it to her. "Miss Leighton," he said, when she came down the stairs at last, to look at the ribbons Dottie was laying out side by side near the glove fabrics. He hoped his voice sounded more genuine to her than it did to his own ears. She looked up with mild surprise, then back at the ribbons. "Oh, hello, sir." With a shock, Winston realised she didn't know who he was. Or perhaps she knew, and had simply forgotten his name. He had been prepared for shyness, for a coy attitude, even perhaps for scorn after his misnomer with Charlotte Alincourt. But he had not prepared in the least for complete apathy. "It is I," he said, rather more stupidly than he meant. "Winston Ambrose." Then, when she turned a rather blank look in his direction, he followed awkwardly with, "The Earl of Longberry." She raised her brow, a pale brow that almost blended in with her skin. "Lord Longberry. How lucky I am to have made your acquaintance." He wondered for a moment if she was making fun of him, but no sooner had the thought crossed his mind than she turned back to the ribbons again. apparently satisfied with the conversation. Winston set his jaw. She would have him pull out his box of charms. Well, so be it. He reached forward and laid a hand alongside hers, almost touching that milky skin, and pointed to the ribbon just beneath it. "This would look lovely with your eyes." She cocked her head. "It is scarlet," she said simply. Then, turning to face him full on, she added rather bluntly, "You think my eyes red?" He shifted uncomfortably. It had been an unfortunate choice of colour, but why had she to be so absolutely literal? Anyone could have picked up on how forward and intentional that gesture was. "I merely meant it set off your eyes. Really, I'm surprised you can stand being in a place like this." She didn't ask him what he meant, just went back to sorting through the slips of satin as though she'd forgotten he was there. "I meant," he began, pulling her attention back to him, "I meant that you must feel very odd being surrounded by all this paltry finery when God has given you such natural beauty. Such effortless elegance must feel affronted by even the slightest accoutrement." She laughed. He blinked. She laughed again, held up a ribbon to examine it more closely, and then handed it across the table to Dotty. "This will do for the trim," she said simply. Then, peeking at Winston from beneath her long lashes, she added, "And you'd best make the gentleman's decisions for him. I fear the man is a bit addled." "I was serious," he protested. He was beginning to feel a bit silly, and he didn't like it one bit. What right had Grace Leighton to ignore his advances? Even the shyest of women gave at least the whisper of a blush or a modest downward glance when he spoke of their beauty, but Miss Leighton acted as though he was merely speaking about the weather or conversing on local politics. He ran his finger along his hat brim. "I wasn't jesting with you." "You're being redundant," she said, passing her money over the table to the shop girl. "If you are serious, then of course you are not jesting." "I merely meant that I wanted you to know my sincerity on the subject. You, Miss Leighton, deserve sincerity above all else." "Above all else?" she shrugged. "Above even love, freedom, my own choices." "Your wit delights me," Winston said, wincing as soon as he did so. It was a weak, flailing attempt at banter, and it failed miserably. It was too obvious and unwieldy, not at all like his normal attempts at romance and conquest. There was something about this woman that caused him to lose focus and disrupted his usual plans. She blessedly didn't say anything about his most recent comment before moving towards the door. "Sir?" the shop girl asked. "The gloves?" Winston was bent on following Miss Leighton and did not at first turn around, but when he reached the door, his prize turned for him and sent a worried look at the shop girl. "You left your purchase," she said. "Oh, it was nothing," he answered back. "Just some gloves for my aunt." "Cousin," the shop girl corrected him. Winston wished himself buried in the ground. "Yes, cousin, I'll come back for it later." He smiled as charmingly as he could and held out his arm to Miss Leighton. "Will you allow me to escort you to your carriage?" She looked at his arm for a moment and then walked out of the shop unassisted. Damn Heath! Winston grit his teeth and followed her. If ever there was a woman more intent on ignoring social signals, it was Grace Leighton. He caught up with her in the middle of the street and called out her name. She turned with an air of mild annoyance. "Yes, Lord Longberry, is it?" A purposeful forgetfulness about his name. How coy! Winston extended his hand and took the one she offered most unwillingly. He bent over it and kissed it, casting a look up into her deep blue eyes. "You have been most modest in our interactions today, but I will speak quite frankly, Miss Leighton. It will save us both a great deal of trouble and, dare I hope, heartache." Please tell me that I might one day have the right to court you. Tell me that I might correspond with you in the meantime and earn a place in your heart. This is all that I need to be a happy man. Will you give me some hope?" Grace Leighton opened her mouth and then shut it again, wrinkling her forehead as though someone had posed her with a baffling question. Then, just when Winston thought he could wait no longer, she gave a quick shake of her head and pulled her hand free from his. "No, I'm afraid not, my lord." And then she walked away from the Earl of Longberry, the famously handsome and rakishly confident Winston Ambrose. He watched her go in utter shock, standing dismayed in the empty street, with his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. Grace Leighton, ugly, plain, coarse Grace Leighton, had turned him down just like that, without the slightest explanation or apology. He could perhaps have borne it if she had given some reason, but it wasn't even as elegant as Charlotte Alincourt's refusal. It was harsh and sudden and final, but not final. He corrected himself. What had begun as a conquest to win back his money and his father's watch had morphed into something far different in the few minutes he'd shared with that red-headed annoyance. This was not a matter of simple gambling. This was now a matter of pride. He wondered, in a rare moment of self-awareness, if it was the dual rejection of Charlotte and Grace that turned this last affront into such a significant wound. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew it was more than that. Grace was not like Charlotte. She was not desirable or sweet or deserving of any gallantry. No, she had been rude and used him ill, and her heart would be his as forfeit. "I swear it," he said to himself, watching her cut her way across the street toward her home. He reached up and touched the brim of his hat with a mocking finger. "Till we meet again, Miss Leighton." Chapter 4. The run-in with Winston Ambrose stayed with Grace all that day and into the next. At first, she had dismissed it as nonsense, but as she thought about it, she realised just how strange it was. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being set up. Not perhaps by Winston himself. Grace hadn't been overly impressed with his wit or intelligence, but maybe by someone else. The more she thought about it, the more she figured Charlotte Alincourt, the petite, vapid princess of the upper London classes, was to blame. Charlotte never cared much for Grace, though the two had been moving in similar circles since they were children. Once, a few years ago, they'd had an unpleasant argument at one of the opening season dances, and Charlotte had never forgiven Grace. She'd been prancing around in her silks and satins, hanging on to the most eligible man in the room, like he alone kept her afloat. She had brought that noble gentleman to Grace, like a hunter parading the spoils before a lesser competitor. Grace bristled at the memory, just as she had that evening so many years ago. "Miss Leighton," Charlotte had said with her sing-song voice and a toss of her pretty curls, "you came tonight. I thought you'd be poring over your books as usual. It's bad for your eyes, you know." Grace had tried to avoid being pulled into Charlotte's nasty orbit. She had tried to look away and let it go. Charlotte had pressed on, her eyes shooting occasional mocking glances of inclusion at the young man towering over her. "Mr. Thomas here was just telling me all about his travels. I say, it's a wonderment that he should include a lady in his inner thoughts. I hardly know what continents and countries he speaks of." "No," Grace had said at last, in clipped tones. "I suppose you wouldn't." Charlotte had shot her a withering glare. "Well, it is not for us to fill our minds with useless things. It is for us, the fairer sex, to better ourselves as ladies should." Grace could still remember the heat that had flowed through her brain at such blatant assumption. She'd pulled herself up to her full height and glowered at her rival. It is good to know, Lady Charlotte, that you think the choosing of linens and the picking of flowers to be more useful than a basic understanding of the geography of your situation. I will come to you first if I need a posy arranged, but if I find myself searching for, say, the easiest route across London, I fear I will have to turn to other minds. It had been an awful success. The man in question had laughed, Charlotte had turned beet red, and the evening had gone to Grace. It would be just like Charlotte to now seek her revenge, setting up Grace to think a man like Winston Ambrose would ever consider her a beauty. She smiled to herself, remembering his attempts to introduce himself. Did he realise how dry and forced he sounded, like he was speaking at sword point? Grace could almost see Charlotte standing behind him, forcing him to go through with the joke. And what a joke it would be, she thought wryly, the smile sliding from her face, if someone as handsome and accomplished as Winston were to walk about with her and then put her in her place a few weeks later. Charlotte would be thrilled. However, Grace was no fool. She would not succumb to their cruel little jest. But fate, it seemed, had other plans for her. 2 days after the incident in the dress shop, she was called again into the sitting room to speak with her mother. When she arrived, she was surprised to see the Baron there as well, standing alongside the fire with his arm resting nonchalantly on the mantelpiece. He looked up with his usual languid air and then went back to ruminating on the flames while his wife drove the conversation. "Grace, dear." Her voice was dangerously congratulatory and happy. Her daughter had learned long ago that to be in the Baroness's good graces was not a positive thing. "I have amazing news." "Really? Is my dress done so very soon?" Grace took a seat on the edge of the couch, ready to take flight at a moment's notice. "Nothing so slight, my dear. Nothing so slight." She looked significantly at the Baron. "Your father will tell you." Grace's father shifted twice and cleared his throat awkwardly before stepping forward and presenting his only daughter with an opened letter. This came today. She unfolded it and read the contents with growing shock. "My dear Baron," it began, "you may be surprised to hear from me. I fear we do not operate in as many of the same circles as I would wish, but my heart will not allow my pen to stay idle any longer. The truth is, I am quite taken with your daughter, Miss Leighton. I have been for some time, and my fervour will not abate. I have some reason to suspect that your daughter may return these affections." Grace paused to scoff, then continued reading, "And I can only hope to have your blessing. I assure you, my intentions are most honourable, and perhaps there may come a day when the noble baronage may be well connected with Longberry. Sincerely, Lord Winston Ambrose, Earl of Longberry." Grace looked up in amazement, momentarily without words. Every part of the letter reeked of arrogance and presumption. That this Winston fellow would go behind her back and petition her father when she had been utterly clear to him only days before was an affront. She felt like a herd of cattle to be bartered over, and she hated the sensation. At last, unable to settle on a respectful turn of phrase, she said simply, "How very self-aware of him to include his title in the signature." "Why do you frown so, daughter?" the Baroness asked. "Of course he includes his title in the letter. It is only right that he should do so, considering he is practically offering to take your hand." Grace's indignation was growing by the minute. She had presumed, wrongly, that this Winston character was as empty-headed as the rest. Now she saw a sly edge to his manoeuvring, and it only worsened him in her opinion. "Have you written back, father?" "No. I wish to speak with you first." "Thank you for waiting." She struggled to mince her words. "I do not want to offend either of you, and certainly not you, mother, but I cannot accept his suit." What? The Baroness fell back on the cushions, as though she'd been struck a significant blow. You cannot mean that. I have reason to believe he is playing a sort of jest on me. Grace swallowed, deeply embarrassed. I am not sure it's of his own invention, but it is of his execution, there can be no doubt. I have seen him before, Mother, at many social functions. He has never looked at me or thought of me. I believe we may even have had conversations in which I spoke and was not heard. Aside from the amusement he may glean from playing some sort of game with my heart, I am certain he can have no use for me. The Baroness pulled out her fan and began waving it before herself. I cannot allow this sort of behaviour, Grace. I have been quiet in the past because I truly believed you had no suitors. I don't, Mamma. Don't interrupt. It's the height of rudeness. But here I find that you have earls at your door and you are scorning them. It is unjust. It is unfair to your family too. You have a duty to us. He doesn't care for me. I cannot believe it. He has never made any proposals of courtship to you. Grace swallowed. She could not tell a lie. He had indeed made a proposal of courtship, as insincere as she thought it might be. At last, she turned to her father for support. Papa, I am telling you he means nothing by this. The Baron shrugged. He sounds serious. He cannot be. Grace took a few steps to her father and took his old hands in her own. She smiled up into his face. Do not allow him to write to me. The Baroness snapped her fan shut. It is not for your father to write to him or not to write to him. You will go upstairs now, and you will send him a thoughtful and grateful letter that will thank him profusely for all he's offering you. You will walk out with him this season, and you will at least spend some time in his company before you decide that he is a rake. Grace opened her mouth to protest, but she could see a resilience in her mother's eyes that had always boded ill in the past. She turned to her father, who turned away, and at last settled on the only course of action she could see as available to her. All right, Mother. I will write to him as you say, but if it all comes to rot, you will remember that I told you he could not care for someone like me. Wait. Her father raised his hand as she turned to leave the room. What do you mean by that, daughter? Grace pursed her lips and looked at him soberly. You know what I mean, Papa. It was a holy moment, a chance for him to step forward and dispel all the lies and embarrassment that Grace had felt around her since she first stepped into womanhood as a plain and ill-advanced woman. She felt a sudden, nerve-wracking ray of hope that perhaps her father would stand up for her as no man ever had. But he looked away, as Charles had, as though he didn't blame her for her plainness, but couldn't take her for it nonetheless. She nodded and forced a cheery smile. I will write to our good Earl. No need to keep him waiting. As her feet climbed the stairs to her room, she felt they pounded out a refrain that echoed in her chest and through to her heart. She thought about what she would say to Lord Longberry, and with every step the refrain grew more vehement, more indignant. He had no right, and she would not bow to his machinations so easily. At her writing table, she took out a cream sheet and dipped her quill into the pot too hurriedly. Blotting her first attempt, she paused, took a breath, and began again. To Lord Longberry, how very creative of you to go behind my back and petition my father when I so frankly denied your suit 2 days past. Such a thing is reminiscent of ancient civilizations and shows an almost admirable ability to make yourself in every way unappealing to a lady such as myself. I have no doubt that your intentions are disingenuous. I would apologize for my rudeness in calling out your actions as I see them, but you have graciously spared any such concern with the sly and deceptive mode of your own behaviour. You have loosened my pen to speak as I wish, which is to tell you that whatever game you are playing at, I would like you to cease at once. Remember, it is not just the laughable, bookish child of the Baron you endanger with your whims. My mother and father, too, fall prey to your graces. I cannot imagine what your true intentions are, although I have enough faith in your ill nature to assume them troublesome and unworthy. Leave me be, good sir. Do not renew your attentions. Miss Grace Leighton. She finished and took a deep breath. She hadn't realised she'd been holding her breath while she wrote, angry and halting, across the page. She reread the words she'd written and wrinkled her forehead in thought. Perhaps it was too harsh and too forward, but she felt it was deserved. Better to cut all ties now with no promise of hope, and the Earl of Longberry could go limping back to his friends to laugh at her expense. It would save him time in the long run, and it would save her as well. She folded the letter and sealed it, ringing for the footman to deliver it at once. As she watched it go down the hall, she tried to feel victorious, but she couldn't deny a pang of regret. It was not, perhaps, regret regarding Lord Longberry, but rather a feeling that her temper would one day distance her from something truly good that she would push away in her zeal for what was right and true. Chapter 5. Winston Ambrose's most noteworthy conquest, before his pursuit of the illustrious Charlotte Alincourt, was Lady Anne Brittington, the daughter of a duke, who summered in Bath near the Longberry estate. They had both been young, she barely 18 and he only 2 years beyond. But she had been the talk of the town, and it was only natural that he should join the flock of young suitors in pursuit of her hand. It had not taken him long to set himself apart from the crowd. Even then, he was one of the most handsome men in England, with well-developed repartee and a casual arrogance that seemed to attract women, like flies, to honey. The first day they'd met was a boating party. She'd been wearing white linen, and her pale hair had been wound up around her head with flowers. She'd been lovely. He waited to approach her, allowing the other men to flounder at the end of her unfinished phrases like fools, instead pouring attentions on one of her lesser cousins and watching as her jealousy grew. When the net was set, he took her arm and pulled her away from the crowd. "How lucky I am to have finally caught your eye, Lord Longberry," she'd said, rather sourly. "You caught my eye from the moment I first saw you, but one does not set off to tear a rose away from the stem," he said, turning and taking her hands in his. "One waits to see the bloom." She'd blushed, as all women did, and from then on she had been his. A summer of garden parties and grand soirees spilled in a whirl from one week to the next, and in the end, Winston and Anne were the town's proclaimed match. It was then, listening to everyone whisper and gossip about their impending marriage, that the Earl of Longberry began to think twice of his impetuous actions. He had wanted to prove himself, to earn the attention of the most notable lady around, but he could not commit himself to her forever. Always, when he thought of that word, forever, he remembered the long farewell with his parents and the manufactured image that came to haunt him in the deepest hours of the night, the image of his sister's face sliding below the icy waters of the Atlantic. There was no such thing as forever. There was only living for today and getting as much out of life as you could in the meantime. "I need more time," he'd told her at the end of the summer. "I can't promise my hand now, and I think it would be foolhardy for you to do so as well. We are both young." "You are young," she'd protested angrily. "I'm on the cusp of marriageable age. If I wait many more years, I will be in disgrace." "Your beauty will not fade in a few more years. Please, give me time." "You are a fool!" She'd fairly spat at him, her anger distorting her pretty, careless features. "You are throwing away a beautiful thing, and all on account of your apathy and pride. Speak not to me again." It was less than a year later that she married a marquis and settled neatly away in the countryside. He wished he could say that he hoped she was happy, but in truth he thought very little of her at all, except to occasionally congratulate himself that he had done the impossible and turned the head of the proud Lady Anne Brittington. It was a memory Winston pulled back to the forefront now, as he looked down at Grace Leighton's letter in his hand. Her verbiage was harsh, bordering on brutality, in fact, but after Winston read it through 3 times consecutively, he laid it aside with a smile. "She's angry," he said to Heath, who was sitting in the room spinning his walking stick in circles. "Why are you smiling then?" Heath stood up and came to his friend's side, taking the letter and looking it over with a piercing gaze. At length, he handed it back to his friend and sat back down. "Don't take it ill, my good man. We've all been there." "You mean we've all been rejected?" Winston laughed shortly. "Or are you implying all men have received hellfire itself from Grace Leighton?" Heath looked momentarily uncomfortable, and then shook off the sentimentality as though it left a bad taste in his mouth. "Tell me why you're smiling." Winston couldn't quite say at first. He wasn't sure why this forward, insulting, miserable little letter had so raised the elusive Miss Leighton in his opinion, but it had. "She has spirit," he said at last. "Spirit is not a good quality in a wife," Heath intoned coldly. "Spirit doesn't make for good parlour conversation, nor does it mix well with the gentlemen of high society." "We aren't talking about her as a wife, though, are we?" Winston tucked the letter into his desk. "We are just talking about the chase, the thrill of the hunt. I grow tired of accommodating women who giggle behind their fans and throw themselves in my path. It's so much less interesting than a woman who gives back a bit of fight." "Well, I'm glad you're happy, and that you're not giving up. I'd hate to take that watch back so soon." Winston thought back over the turn of Grace's phrase in the letter, and he thought with sudden warmth that her ire had awoken something long latent in his mind. After his parents and sister had died, he'd coped mostly with lavish excess and apathetic turn of mind. If you could lose everything you loved in one fatal swoop, then why risk loving anything? But here was Grace Leighton fighting for her good name and unwilling to let him trod on it with his games, as she called them. It made him want to fight too, and he didn't know why. "It is hard," Heath drawled, "that she's cottoned onto your game so fast. She doesn't think you're genuine. She's sharper than I thought she would be. It doesn't do her credit. A girl can be forgiven for being clever if she has a pretty face and a winning smile, but wit in a woman as ugly as Grace Leighton is unforgivable." Heath stabbed his walking stick into the floor and slid his fingers along the rounded top with a harsh touch. "Congratulate yourself, then. You found me a worthy challenge." Winston felt suddenly weary of Heath's presence. He needed to think, to plot a way into Grace's heart. And he didn't think his sly acquaintance would have many helpful ideas in that arena. "Have you any other projects in town today?" he asked at last, hoping Heath would take the hint. "No, just you." Winston rustled some papers on his desk and tried to look busy. "Well, I'm sorry to say I've a busy docket today. You'll have no good company from me at present." Heath narrowed his eyes and rose slowly. "Then I will see you at a later date." "Yes, of course." Winston shook hands with his friend and led him to the door. When he'd gone, Winston rang for a courier he had used on occasion and returned to the library to wait. As he thought up his plan, he turned over the difficulties before him. His usual tools in such matters were condensed to the power of his good looks and the quickness of his tongue. At the dressmaker's, neither seemed to have any effect. Winston's long dark hair was kept wavy and pulled back from his face. He had a strong jaw and a fine set of shoulders. He'd heard women refer to his green eyes as intoxicating, and he knew how to leverage all this to maximum effect. But with Grace Leighton, his good looks had seemed somehow both garish and inconsequential. She hadn't even looked at him for any length of time, and when she did, she'd turned away, just as suddenly, with the languid air of one who had better things to see and do. None of what he'd said in her presence had had any effect either. His tongue seemed a dull instrument, and hers freshly sharpened. "How can I win her over?" he mused aloud. It wouldn't be with his looks or his tongue, so he would have to find another avenue into her heart. He would have to discover what she loved, aside from books, and he would have to pursue that thing until she was forced to see him as an interesting and engaging man. Just then a knock came on the door, and the footman showed in a rough-looking man in a tweed coat. "Hello, sir." "Thomas." "Hello. It's been a long time." "You need something run out to the country, my lord." "I need the money, but I haven't a horse and cart at present, so you'll have to pay more for the rental." "No, Thomas." Nothing of that sort. Winston tried to push aside the guilty feeling that played with his insides. "I have a special task for you." He pulled out a piece of paper and jotted down some notes. "Can you read, Thomas?" "Well enough." "I have written here an address and a name. It's a lady, Miss Grace Leighton. Her father is a baron. I wish you to follow her and ascertain what she does with her time. She is very busy and rarely present in society. I suspect she spends her time elsewhere around London. Do you think you can follow her unnoticed?" Thomas shifted side to side, twisting his cap in his hands. "Is it illegal, sir?" No. Winston wasn't sure, but he smiled broadly and hoped for the best. "I mean, the lady no harm. It's a matter of the heart. Just watch and learn." Watch and learn. And be careful not to be seen. Tell me the pattern of her days and the things that seem to bring her joy. At last, Thomas seemed convinced. After affirming that he saw no real harm in Winston's plot, he pocketed the down payment and disappeared from the house into the street beyond. Almost as soon as he'd gone, the butler appeared as though out of the shadows with a crate of books to put on the shelves. "What are those?" Winston asked, leaping to his feet and going to examine the trove. The butler stepped back in surprise. "They are the new books from the cellars. Your father always liked me to pick out a few new ones and keep the shelves current." He paused, as though realizing the sentimental line he might have crossed. "I didn't mean any offence. I can stop the practice at once if you desire." "Of course not. I find it a worthy endeavour indeed." "Do you, my lord?" Winston tried to ignore the implied statement in the question. Winston had never been one for new ideas or the written word. He was more a man of the races and ladies and the gambling tables. To sit and read a book for any period of time seemed like a waste to him, and no one knew this better than the household staff who cleaned up after his many excesses. He thought to laugh off the butler's statement, but he thought suddenly of Grace Leighton and his new quest. She had called herself bookish in the letter she wrote. Bookish. There was a clue as to some possible manner of connecting with her. He reached inside the crate and took out a book at random. "I think I'll read this one." "You, my lord?" Winston shot the other man a sharp glance. "Yes. Please, do us both a favour and pretend this is a regular occurrence. We may have differing likes and dislikes, but I'm not an utter brute." The butler nodded silently, and Winston went to sit down with the book in his lap. It was small, with gold lettering on a blue background, out of sight. He flipped it open and began reading on the first page, Chapter 6. Grace left early the next morning, unwilling to face her parents' questions. If pressed, she would not lie to them about her letter to Lord Longberry, and she dreaded yet another round of protestations from her mother and disappointed looks from her father. She dressed plainly, wearing a brown calico with white flowers that would help disguise the grime and dirt of her destination from prying eyes. She put a dark cloak around her shoulders and laced on a sturdy pair of boots. Lastly, she braided her hair and pinned it in a tight bun at the base of her neck in the style of the lower classes, topping it all off with a dark bonnet and no gloves. She knew the way well, but the Baron always insisted she bring a footman along for what he perceived to be safety purposes. Therefore, she was obliged to allow John Martin, the second footman, to walk primly alongside her with his nose wrinkled in disgust. She didn't care for Martin much when they began these journeys, but she'd seen a softening in him during his visits to the lowest quarters of London, and though he would rather die than admit it, she knew he had a soft spot in his heart for the children at the orphanage where they were headed. Calloway Orphanage was located a half-hour's walk from Grace's plush mansion home, a distance that might have seemed daunting to a girl less accustomed to daily exercise. For Grace, it was appallingly close. She couldn't believe that such a short distance from where she grew up there were people starving, parentless, and destitute. You don't know the half of what goes on under the noses of the richest people in London, her aunt had said the first time they visited the orphanage together. Aunt Marion had been a benefactor of the establishment, and in her passing, Grace had inherited her passion for the children. That particular day, Grace had been only 13 years old, still nursing a cruel comment one of the upper-class boys had made about her freckles and her ugly hair. "Aunt Marion, do you think when I grow up I will be beautiful?" She remembered as though it were yesterday her aunt's look of surprise, quickly followed by a look of sharp annoyance. "Why do you ask that, child?" "Mama says my hair might turn auburn, and I might start looking a bit more like a woman." "You're fine enough for me, lassie." "No, I'm not." Grace blushed even now, remembering her vanity. "I have fine enough eyes and a small nose, but Mama says such features won't save a plain face and figure." At that, Aunt Marion had whirled on her with flashing eyes. "Perhaps that is so, my child. Perhaps you will never grow into the mincing, vapid beauty that plagues the women of this city. But what of it? God did not put you on this earth to drag around your own image and hurl it at unsuspecting men. He put you here to portray his image to others, just as saint. James said it. Serve the widow and the poor and the fatherless." It was a landmark moment in Grace's life. She remembered the sharp shame she'd felt at her own misplaced priorities, the growing excitement she'd felt moments afterwards at the thought that Aunt Marion thought her capable of good and noble and strong things. Aunt Marion didn't see her frizzy hair and plain features, but then Aunt Marion would also not have noticed if she'd been the beauty of the town. No, for Aunt Marion she was just Grace, capable of extending God's hand of mercy to those around her. It was a noble call, and required attributes of strength and dignity and wit that Grace came to treasure far more than the weak accomplishments of the age. This fine morning, as Grace cast a mischievous glance at Martin, she felt a spring coming into her step at the memory. The orphanage was not just a place for her to pour money and time. It brought her an endless supply of joy and merriment, and she could almost feel the children's arms around her neck as she neared the great doors. "Miss Leighton!" The doors were thrown open almost before Martin reached for the bell, showing inside a plump serving girl with pink cheeks and a rosy smile. You're back so soon." I couldn't stay away. Grace tumbled into the inner corridor, aware that Martin was simultaneously taking up his sombre place by the door to wait until she was ready to leave. She untied her bonnet and tossed it, along with her heavy cloak, into a pile on the side bench. She reached out and hugged the girl warmly. "You're a pretty picture this morning, Elsie. How are the children?" "The matron's about to read morning verses and then they're going to eat. Please, sit with us." Grace knew better than to refuse. She'd been embarrassed at first to take the little food the children had, but after a few visits with her aunt, she'd learned that to refuse the paltry offerings brought before her was an insult. She followed Elsie into the hall where 6 long placard tables held rows of squirming children eager for their morning gruel. At the end of the hall, Matron Marlowe, a twinkly-eyed old woman who had been a long-time friend of Aunt Marian's, caught sight of Grace and smiled broadly. "Ah, Miss Leighton, what a pleasant surprise. Pull up a seat at the back table there and you can listen to our verses with us." Grace slipped onto a chair at the end of the table, flanked on either side by a boy wiping snot from his nose and a scrawny girl staring at her with wide, unflinching eyes. "O Lord, our Lord," the matron began reading, "how excellent is your name in all the earth who have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouths of babes and nursing infants you have ordained strength because of your enemies, that you may silence the enemy and the avenger." She finished and closed the book. "Before we pray and begin our food, I will ask you if anyone here knows what this verse means." One of the bigger children raised their hand. "Yes, Mary. Even the children can praise God." "Very good, Mary." Then, catching sight of a little boy, "And you, William?" The boy scrambled to his feet, as though his delivery required great solemnity. "If you are an enemy of God, he'll make you mute." The matron blinked, then consulted her book again, then laughed outright. "I see. Silence the enemy. Yes, William, but there are many ways God can silence pain and destruction in our lives, not simply through making mutes of the world." There was a prayer there, with many sweetly bowed heads, and then everyone, Grace included, was given a bowl of gruel and a spoon. She ate half of hers, then gave the rest to the nearby boy, who was staring at it with eager eyes. She leaned back to Elsie and said, under her breath, "I'll send a box of strawberries over this afternoon. It will give the children a surprise for breakfast tomorrow." Elsie answered her with a smile. Watching the children wolf down their food in threadbare clothes, Grace felt almost nauseated at the memory of the dress and the shopping spree only a few days before. All that ribbon and lace, and here before her were children who had never even felt such fabrics, much less worn them. It was all to ease her mother's mind about the London season, Grace knew, but even that seemed a paltry excuse for the blatant waste of money. She made a silent vow to spend no more on clothes that season, and to take the money given her to the children for their shirts and dresses instead. When the children were done, they stood and filed into haphazard lines on their way to the schoolroom and chores. Watching them go like ducklings after Elsie, Grace fell to the back of the line to speak with Matron Marlowe. "Madam," she said respectfully, "where is Victoria? I did not see her at mealtime." The matron's face fell. "She's poorly again. I think it's settled in her lungs. She didn't have the energy to come to the hall, but I know it would do her well to see your face." Grace felt a pit of worry open up in her stomach. She nodded silently and followed the matron to the sick hall. There were only 4 beds in the small space, but they were clean and white, and Aunt Marian had insisted on putting in 2 shining windows to let light stream into the dim room. In one bed, a frustrated little boy was nursing a broken leg and looking very ready to be gone from the bed. 2 more beds were empty, but in the last one, Grace saw an unmistakable little form. "Victoria," she said softly, kneeling by the side of the bed and laying a cool hand on the little girl's forehead. At once the girl opened her eyes and turned to Grace. She was not quite 8 years old, but very thin and small for her age. She had large dark eyes and shaggy brown hair that lay across the pillow like discarded straw. She smiled weakly when she saw her visitor, and the sight brought a stab of pain to Grace's tender heart. "Gracie," she said. All the children called her by her first name. "Yes, I hear you are feeling poorly today." "It's not so bad that you have to go," the little girl said hurriedly, pushing up on her elbows in an attempt to look better. "Please stay." "Of course I'll stay, Victoria. Lie back now." Grace settled the girl again and drew her hand gently across the child's hair and forehead. "Do you need anything?" "Will you tell me a story?" A lump in her throat, Grace settled on the one she knew was Victoria's favourite. Once upon a time, there was a little girl who wanted very much to be a princess. She was just the right height for the job, and very, very clever. "And beautiful?" Victoria asked, as she always did. "And beautiful," Grace answered softly, but a wicked witch wanted to keep her from her true purpose and locked her up in a candy shop. What happened? She knew what happened. She always asked. Well, the little girl could only become a princess if she avoided all the temptations in the candy shop, but she didn't know this. There were bonbons and peppermints and the longest strips of pulled sugar you've ever seen. Victoria's eyes widened. It was her very favourite part of the story. Did she eat any? She wanted to. Oh, she wanted to so badly, but she knew the witch's curse and vowed not to touch a single piece. To be certain of her task, she decided to pretend that each piece of candy was a disgusting thing. The bonbons were forest moss, the pulled sugar was mud from the riverbed, and the peppermints were barnacles from the bottom of a ship. That was very clever of her. She was clever. That is how she came to be a princess. At the end of 3 days, the witch returned, but not a piece of candy had been touched. Rejoicing, the princess was set free to pursue her own destiny without the distractions of that awful place. It was a truncated version of the longer tale, but Grace could see that her little charge was getting excited, and every bit of excitement drained her energy a little more. She laid a hand on Victoria's head again. "I will sing you a song, and you can close your eyes. I'll stay until you're asleep. Promise?" "Promise." Grace began to sing an old English melody. "I see the stars see me. God bless the stars, and God bless me." She went on to sing every verse, making up words when she ran out of traditional lyrics. Victoria dropped off to sleep, breathing at last in heavy slumber. Grace hated the way her laboured breath trundled in and out of her lungs, lifting that tortured little chest with painful regularity. "I wish I could take you home with me. I wish I could take you all, each and every one," Grace said softly, tears starting to her eyes. "You're doing wonders for them, my lady." It was the matron. Grace wondered how long she'd been standing there in silence, and stood abruptly, wiping the tears from her face. "How can I help her?" "She's well cared for here. You yourself supply most of her food and clothing, and she has shelter and kind guardians." Grace nodded grimly. "But she would do better with a doctor." The matron nodded. Both knew it was a sore subject in Grace's household. When Victoria first fell ill, Grace had implored her parents to give money for a doctor, but the Baron and Baroness, already uncomfortable with their daughter's philanthropic ventures, considered this to be an affront to the gentry. They forbade her to use their money to send a poor girl from the gutter to their respected doctor. But what will happen if she doesn't get help? The matron pursed her lips. We can't know for sure, but if something doesn't change, in a year or two. She trailed off into silence, the awful reality hanging between them. Grace thought at once of Winston Ambrose and his thousands of pounds. Perhaps if she were to agree to his courtship, then her mother would be kindlier inclined towards her philanthropic efforts. Yes, there was an idea. Trade a few dismal interactions with London's most vapid man for a chance to take Victoria to a good doctor. Grace checked herself. Was it madness? Was it cruel to use him in that way? But then she was almost certain that he was trying to use her, and how could his affections be thus genuine? She would simply be leveraging his own cruelty to her use. She cast a look at Victoria's pained little face, deep in slumber, and decided then and there that she had to do something. Chapter 7. The Alencourt ball was always the height of the season, but it came early this year. Winston suspected they were trying to get ahead of the ambassador's arrival from overseas. The Alencourts never liked being upstaged. He dressed in frustration, his thoughts elsewhere. The man he'd sent to follow Grace had not yet reappeared, and he had no further idea how to woo her in the meantime. He found, for the first time, that the idea of spending an evening at a ball surrounded by laughing guests seemed mildly annoying and unproductive. He thought of the little blue volume he'd taken up in his spare time and wished to his own surprise that he could stay inside that particular evening and read with a small glass of sherry in one hand and the fire crackling merrily at his feet. But no, he'd promised Heath he'd attend. Perhaps it would be a chance to show Charlotte Alencourt what she was missing. He fixed his cravat, practiced his signature carefree grin in the mirror, and then made his way downstairs to his carriage. The Alencourt mansion was ablaze with light and laughter when he arrived fashionably late and disembarked near the front steps. There were streams of people arrayed in brilliant white and cream, ascending the stairs like stars moving up into the firmament. Unbidden, a phrase from the book Winston had been reading shot into his mind. If only we could look through the marble floors and see the blood and sweat beneath. Sentimental nonsense. He pushed it from his mind and swept into the house, conscious of the heads turning in his direction, as they always did. Lord Longberry, welcome to our abode. Winston, my man, we need to speak later about that game. Lord Longberry, you simply must meet Miss Charleston. He moved through the circles as he always did, with grace and poise and a set smile. Then he looked up and saw something that brought the whole rhythm of his movement to a halt. Grace Leighton, arrayed in a lavender dress, sipping punch alone in the corner. Her hair was different, pulled up loosely and spritzed with something to tame the frizz. She was still not a beauty like Charlotte Alencourt, but she drew him to her almost against his will. There was a bevy of women nearby, gossips all, but he didn't know when he would have another chance. Miss Leighton. He couldn't read her expression when she turned and met his eyes. It wasn't surprise exactly, more like the dread that comes when you're waiting for something you're not sure you want to happen. Lord Longberry. Winston felt the eyes of the room peering at him with harsh intensity. Was Charlotte Alencourt among those intrusive eyes? He kept his gaze on Grace, taking in her expression, her face, and her eyes. How had he not noticed her eyes before? They were forget-me-not blue. Had they belonged to a different face, they would have been a striking characteristic. I was told you don't usually attend events such as these. You can't believe what you're told, she answered, her voice no more revealing than her expression. He bowed then, at last, surprised to find he'd forgotten his classic manners. "Well, the ball is better for your presence here." "Is it?" She looked around at the sparkling room, a smile playing on her lips. "I wasn't aware I was making any sort of impact." "You can't always judge impact by what you see on the surface." "On the contrary, my lord, it is exactly by the ripples that you know a rock has been thrown into the lake." Her comment, rather scornfully given, pushed Winston over the edge. He decided at once to make a few ripples of his own, and held out his hand to her as the first strains of a waltz pierced the room. "May I have this dance?" She looked at him for half a beat in near wonderment, and then smiled rather forcedly back at him. "Of course." As Winston pulled her to the floor, he caught a glimpse of the crowded room behind them. There were women already whispering behind fans, casting disparaging glances in their direction and calling to their friends to further discuss the abnormality. Grace Leighton, dancing at a social event, Winston Ambrose, asking her it was all dreadfully preposterous and uncalled for. Winston caught sight of Heath's face as he set up across from Grace in the line of dancers, and he winced inwardly at the confident look he saw there. Heath was the only one who did not look surprised. Instead, Winston's friend had an amused, sly look on his face. It threw Winston, and he wondered with a pang of guilt how hurt Grace Leighton would be when she realised she was merely the object of a bet. It would hurt her badly, he thought, although he couldn't be sure. She was staring back at him across the dance floor, as though she was challenging him to a duel rather than a dance. As the music built, they bowed to one another and came together in the centre of the room, clasping hands and turning in a circle before beginning the customary promenade down the centre of the room. Winston was taken aback by her touch. Her hands were smooth and cool. "How very charitable of you to invite me first to the dance floor, Lord Longberry," Grace ventured at last. "You know that the word charity is rooted in the word love," he answered, thankful that she'd provided such an open door through which to walk and woo her. She tilted her head as though disappointed in him. "Now, that's just not true, my lord. Charity descends from Middle English, which is in itself from the French, and before that, from the Latin for giveness, not love. Love, in Latin, is amor. There may be an English connection, but I assure you amor does not appear in charitat." Winston blinked at this onslaught, recovering himself the only way he knew how, with his inevitable charm. He pulled Grace near to him during the next whirl, sliding his hand along her lower back and spinning quite a bit more closely than was required for the traditional step. In the past, such a move had fairly melted the woman of his affections, but with Grace Leighton, Winston was beginning to expect the unexpected. "You're holding me quite close, Lord Longberry." "You noticed? It is not proper. Release me at once." He did so, but only because the steps of the dance required it. They spun away, and when they came back together, he decided to speak his mind for once. "You're one to speak about propriety," he began, the proper Miss Leighton, refusing to purchase a new gown for the season, turning down gentlemen in the street, sending brash letters. "You went behind my back, interrupting gentlemen during their dances." He shrugged, aware that he was gaining the upper hand. "Haven't you read Fordyce's, my lady? A lady who interrupts is the height of inappropriate behaviour." She smiled coyly, a dangerous sign. "Fordyce's is for ladies, good sir. I hope you learned everything you needed there about how to conduct yourself at a tea party and when it is appropriate to lift one's skirts." Winston smiled widely. "I lift my skirts only when crossing muddy roads." "Nay, even then it is not appropriate. Better a ruined hem than a ruined reputation." He leaned a little closer on the next promenade. "You haven't yet addressed your rude letter." Such a response to a suitable offer of courtship is unheard of. The important word being suitable, she replied with sugary sweetness. "You directly ignored my most honest refusal and went to my father for his permission. I understand that is the societal norm." "I am not a camel," she said, a bit too loudly. Winston hid a smile, and Grace dropped her voice as she continued. "I am not a camel, or a herd of cattle to be bought and bartered without my consent. I've made that very clear." "Very, but now you have trespassed yet again by arguing with me in public. It is not done, my lady." "It is also not done for a gentleman to be so free and loose with an honourable woman's reputation. You addressed me openly in a shop, where others could have heard, and then on a street, and now at a dance." "When am I to speak with you?" Winston asked playfully. "Alone." "In a darkened room." She blushed, then forced herself to make eye contact. Winston couldn't help smiling at her spunk. "You know that is not what I mean." "Oh, the all-important Miss Leighton can now tell a person with absolute certainty what they do and do not know. Remarkable. You should teach your ways to the masses." "You are goading me." "You are allowing yourself to be goaded." He couldn't help noticing how her eyes flashed in her pale, freckled face. She looked remarkable, perhaps not beautiful, but definitely remarkable. "If you are trying to put yourself forward," she said through tight teeth, "you are doing an ill job of it. I have done all the proper things. I have met with you, written to you, and asked you to dance. It is a formula for success." They were nearing the end of the dance, spinning in the last steps of the waltz, and Winston found he was dreading the end. Sparring with her had been one of the brighter conversations he'd shared in a long time, and he didn't want to release that soft white hand. Just before they broke away, she leaned in and said, in a low, calm voice, "It is a pity, following your formula, that I am not an equation." The dance ended, and as the final strings were drawn across the cello and violin at the far end of the room, Grace turned wordlessly from her partner and made her way to the cloak closet. Winston took off after her, not caring for the first time whether or not he was being watched by the attentive room. He caught her fumbling with her cloak. "Miss Leighton, are you leaving so soon?" She looked up at him, two bright spots of colour burning in her cheeks. "I have had quite enough. I have caused you offence." She slid her eyes closed, as though struggling to deal patiently with a hopeless child. "Please, Lord Longberry, return to your many admirers. I am simply feeling ill and cannot continue the charming evening." "That is surprising. You seemed well enough only moments ago." She shook her head and turned to go, but he caught her arm in his as she did so. "I will escort you, my lady." She looked about to protest, but in the end leaned against his arm as though suffering under a great imposition, and followed him out into the garden and around to the carriage centre. They walked in silence, she for some unknown reason, Winston because he could think of nothing else to say. He found himself wishing he was a sparkling conversationalist for this woman who had strangely moved him during their brief dance, but he knew he had nothing to offer her in that department. They stopped at last at her carriage, and she surprised him by turning in his direction with a weak attempt at a smile. "I do not mean to be a foul blot on your evening, Lord Longberry. You did me a—" She paused, as though choking over the word. "Service by asking me to dance, and I thank you." "It was no service." "It was." She looked off for a moment, and then back at him with a little sigh. "You are staying at your family estate in London, are you not?" "I am," he answered, surprised. Then I will send over an invitation for tea later on this week. Perhaps you can find your way to the Baron's manor and we can— She paused again. Chat. Winston was genuinely shocked. He hadn't had a chance yet to use his charms, to bring Miss Leighton crawling to his side with her heart in her hands. No, she acted as though she was doing a favour for him, a fact that would have injured his pride if he didn't so desire to see her again. As she rode away in the carriage, he reassured himself that his new interest in the lady had nothing to do with her personal charms. He just felt the chase drawing to an end, he tried to tell himself, and he wanted to finish well.
Scan the QR code or click on the link in the description to read the full book. The full audiobook will be available on YouTube in a few days. What did you like the most? Comment below and share this video on your social media and with your friends. Watch one of the following videos. Subscribe to our channel, like this video, and hit the notification bell to not miss any new audiobooks. Thank you for watching.